Welcome back everyone dito sa latest episode ng FYI, a Voter Education Series. But not just anyone, kasama po natin the Dean and the Loca. Thank you very much, Dean Gan and Dean Ed, for joining us. Thank you so much. Ang dami natin pag-usapan. Obviously, what I love about discussing with you folks is that talagang doon makikita ng tao nung silbi ng public administration and political science. So accordingly, there are a couple of things I want to discuss today. So one of the things that lumabas sa ating hearings, sa Senate hearings recently, ang daming oras pa lang yung Senate, mag-hearing pala was itong admission ni Secretary Remulla na nag-fail itong judicial institutions natin, among other things. So that raises really questions about institution building, capacity building, among others. I want to start with you, Dean Ed. Do we have indeed a capacity issue when it comes to not only our judicial institutions but in general? Kasi overwhelmed yung courts natin, like one court handling more than 700 cases. Yung penitentiary system natin, 60% ay pre-trial detainees. I mean, for me, that's a symptom of a more fundamental problem, which is yung medyo mahina yung public administration systems natin, no?
Well, I'll even go beyond that argument. Ang thinking ko is looking at, observing what is happening right now, there's really a fundamental failure of critical thinking. No? Kasi why is it that, for example, fake news is very easy to peddle nowadays, no? It's very difficult for especially a certain generation nito mga kabataan ngayon to separate the grain from the chaff. Hirap na hirap sila dun eh. Noong araw kasi it was easy to distinguish propaganda from facts. Ngayon medyo it's becoming increasingly difficult for for some people, especially of a certain generation, to make that distinction. And of course, hindi naman yun, that doesn't end there. It also goes into the weakness of institutions because meron ng problema sa critical thinking, and so therefore it also reflects on public institutions as well. So not really surprised at what's happening right now.
So going back to our yung first episode natin on disinformation and all of that, is political literacy a fundamental crisis we have? And why? So basically failure of education system then, which is what, right?
Well, I think absolutely you're correct. At yung sasabi nga ni Dean Ed dito, yung crisis ng ating mga kabataan ngayon. Anong mamaya natin yan? The crisis of institutions also accompanies with the lack of critical thinking. So, ayan yung remember yung debate no, ng agent and institution. No, sino ba talaga ang may sala? Mukhang parehas sa Pilipinas ang nangyayari. No? So, we are witnessing, for example, yung mga mamayan na may kakulangan na in terms of how to think critically. And at the same time, we have a very weak institutions that are being used by certain group of individual to pursue their interests. Kaya pag tingin mo yung maigi, ang bawa sa public administration nga, ang binabanggit namin dyan, we also experiencing, for example, the crisis of democracy. Dahil hindi maayos mag-function yung ating mga institution, it's supposed to be provide yung public service and also caters to the welfare of the people. But it's very unfortunate dahil nagiging instrument na lamang ng ilang mga individual, ng ilang mga politiko, no, rather than sasabi natin na serving the common good or the greater good, no, in achieving itong welfare provision, no, in particular ng ating saligang batas at ng ating local government code.
Okay, so this is interesting, right? So because the I won't say cliche, but it's almost a cliche. Yung weak state, strong society. Ang lumalabas ngayon is parang weak state, weak society rin. Dahil ba't yung society mo ay very vulnerable to disinformation? And I mean, we're not saying this in a snooty, elitist way. We're saying this na talagang may problema tayo na comprehensive democratic crisis, right? Na both the state institutions have their vulnerabilities, but even now, because of the advent of disinformation, the advent of digital, also sort of digital, diffusion of misinformation, things are more complicated. Now, I want to go more to the public administration part, but I have a much more historical question also. Yung mga weaknesses na nakikita natin sa ating lipunan, whether sa ating mga gobyerno or whether sa ating patterns of voting among others, to be more historical about this, may kinalaman ba ito dun sa genesis ng ating democratic institution, meaning what was built during the Commonwealth period? Because John Seidel, among other scholars, Benedict Anderson, this whole cacique democracy, bossism, exactly. Ang sinasabi nila basically, and I think Fukuyama also discussed that dito sa yung origins of political order, political order and political decay, yung second volume niya. Di ba, ang explanation niya is, when it comes to issue of democracy, mahalaga yung sequencing. If strong institutions and rule of law was built before introduction of elections, you tend to have a much more sustainable system over time. But when you have introduction of elections before establishment of strong bureaucracy and institutions of rule of law, usually may problema ka. Ano po yung basa niyo dito sa whole bossism, cacique democracy, and sequencing debate that people like Francis Fukuyama have been discussing a lot recently?
Well, ako ang tingin ko dyan, I agree with you dun sa problematic that you're proposing, no? But in my case, kasi I'd like to look at it as a in a historical context. Remember, tayo sa public administration, we begin with the politics administration dichotomy,
Right.
which predated all of those theories that you
Wilson,
mentioned. Sabi ni Woodrow Wilson that there has to be a separation of what is political and what is
You mean the Chicago
administration.
University professor Woodrow Wilson or the president Woodrow
The
Wilson?
president.
The president, who was
Right.
also president of Princeton.
Princeton, sorry. Yeah,
Princeton,
Princeton, sorry.
One and the same person.
Yeah, sorry.
Kaya lang, when we remember that when public administration came to the Philippines in 1952, imported yung yung disiplina lock, stock, and barrel. So, people were thinking, are we also going to have a separate domain for politics and separate domain for administration? That never took hold in the Philippines. We were never convinced in theory and in practice about the separation of politics and administration. Unfortunately, my sense is that we took the wrong kind of politics. Kasi yung politics-administration dichotomy na nireject natin sa Pilipinas is supposed to be sana na, okay, politics, when we say politics here, we talk about good public policy. And we should not have any apologies over the fact that when we talk about administration, it's not objective in that sense. It has preference for certain sectors of society, particularly those that are marginalized. Unfortunately, yung discourse at saka yung practice ng politics in the politics administration dichotomy natin, parang naging mali. And I think it's also rooted in a very large way to our experience in the Second World War, particularly the Japanese occupation, when it was considered patriotic to do things that are anathema to the existence of government, corruption, etc.
So path dependency ang argument mo, basically.
No, not necessarily path dependency, but we have to recognize that historical factor.
Of state building and distortions of the state building.
Ako gusto ko lang dagdagan yung sinasabi ni Dean Ed dahil, for example, yung mga serious students and scholar of public administration will go back sa major critique din natin in Philippine politics administration is, yung, sabi nga, the idea of politics that we embrace ay hindi yung politics talaga for the common good, but rather the Jacksonian democracy had been taught to us. Na ibig sabihin, to the winners belong the spoils. Diba? Spoil system. Mas naging ganun ang context natin. Kaya ang nangyari, no, yun ang nagiging in terms of getting the best and the brightest. Ang nagiging represent yan, sino ba yung mga tumulong sa atin? Sino pa loyal and supporters and
biggest donors.
The donors, the PACs sa US. Kaya nang nagiging system. And yun yung mga neighbors. Kaya kapag sa mga basic public ed courses, ang sasabi namin sa mga estudyante, mukhang ang namana natin na sistema sa Amerika, yung hindi magandang karanasan, yung hindi magandang practice is the Jacksonian system rather than the Act number 5 na dapat merit system and so on and so forth.
Magaling talaga tayo mag-inherit ng worst from our colonizer, whether Spanish.
Tama dyan.
Bakit parating the worst of Spanish, the worst of American, worst of Japanese? But going back to this, the issue of how our democracy and nation building was formed. Ano naman yung effect ng pre-colonial? The reason I'm asking is because one of our most esteemed historians, I think you can guess who this person was. I gave a talk in Australia before about rise of Duterte, and I used the more Benedict Anderson perspective of yung cacique democracy. And sabi niya, I don't agree with that because mas dapat tignan natin yung datu system, for instance, yung judge and executioner. And parang,
All in
perfect
one.
nga kay Digong, di ba? Kasi,
Lahat, all in
what
one
about
na.
the pre-colonial effect? Ako kasi combined, hybrid eh. I combine the pre-colonial, the Spanish, and the American to kind of understand bakit ang weird yung democracy natin. Or do we still have traces of pre-colonial Philippines? Or you think that's a kind of a too much anthropological?
No, I don't think so. I think it's still present, especially in local politics. Eh. If you look at it at the local level, nandyan pa din yan. Eh. Remember that yung pre-colonial times natin I don't think it can be isolated as an incident in history that has no relationship to what is happening now.
Yeah.
Of course, I mean, our attempt to sort of decentralize more, first centralize and then decentralize, is all rooted to our pre-colonial system. But to say that it has no effect anymore, I think I don't agree with that. It still has effect, especially dun sa mga local. So, and this dovetails with what you were mentioning about John Seidel's bossism.
Yeah.
No? Yung mga tipo ng mga local leaders na mga siga and all. And perhaps that's also one angle that you can look at to explain the rise of Duterte.
And Duterte was a perfect local candidate who jumped leapfrog to the presidency and basically replicated at national level, and it appealed to some part of our political culture, right? Ikaw din, what do you think about this continuity of this kind of the big man, the strong man? Kasi again, this is important because I use the term caudillo because we have similar system in Latin America, the caudilismo, etc. But then again, the pushback against that was, but how come political dynasties are much more entrenched in Philippines than Latin American cases? And then explanation ng mga Spanish experts sa atin is because of your pre-colonial dato system. Sabi niya, walang ganyan yung mga, I don't know, Incas and Aztec comparatively. So what happened is that when the Spanish came here, of course, there was a difference, mas maliit yung population ng Spanish. But sabi niya, one factor bakit ang dami ng dynasties is the Spanish realized ang lakas ng dato system, so ang dami mga principales. So basically what we're seeing today is really a continuation of what the Spanish and Americans had to concede as a geopolitical reality of colonizing a country like the Philippines. Kaya daw, iba yung Philippines, even compared to Mexico, Argentina, because like Argentina, the number of political dynasties were 5 to 10%. Mexico at this height was around 15%, I heard. Philippines is like 80%. Like it's not even in the same league. So, do you think we're even unique among our fellow post-colonial Spanish influence, American influence country?
Well, meron na palang uniqueness din talaga yung Pilipinas. No? Pero, halimbawa, ang isa sa mga argument, bakit meron tayong the big man or big person, authoritarian, what have you, recognition, well, sabi nila yung Asian values daw, di ba? Respect to the authority. No? May isa sa mga justification. Pero, again, babalikan mo nga yan, even doon nga sa pre-colonial period talaga natin, naging convenient din kasi yung ating dato system na where you combine executive, legislative, and judiciary. Yeah. No?
In one man.
In one person. No? So, lahat yan. So, parang inalay natin lahat dahil nga we're not into tradition na dapat may check and balance sa atin. So, it's really sort of, a Western idea sa atin ng check and balance. Kaya, ang nangyari nga, when it's stuck to accountability, ang laging issue natin, ako lahat yan No? It falls on me. Ako ang sisihin nyo. Laging gano'n that's what White President Duterte mentioned several times. So, kung may mangyari dito, ako lagi. I mean, that's also rooted on what kind of historical development that we encountered from our past leadership. Panahon din nila Quezon, gano'n din naman ang mga naging epekto. Siyempre, mas iba lang ang komplikasyon ngayon, no? Kaya nga, kung tignan mo yung election, yung campaign ngayon, maganda na sabi rin ni Dean Ed kanina, if you will situate that in our types of candidate, nagiging attractive. Pag meron kang pinapromise na, di ba, yung mga kandidato, tumatakbo sa bilang lawmaker, nagpapromise ng mga executive action. Yung mga mayor, nagpapromise ng mga legislative action. Which is wrong. No? Pero again, babalik ka dun sa pinanggalingan natin na parang convenient sa atin na yung nasa isang tao yung kapangyarihan ng executive, legislative, and judiciary.
Yeah, and the voters go to the congressman to ask help for welfare issues, etc.
Yeah, precisely.
It's a two-way street. But that has implication for party system, right? That's why it's hard to have a real political party.
Yeah, but before that, one fundamental thing that has to be discussed is this. in the pre-colonial times, when people chose their leader, it was because of certain normative values that
Yeah.
pinakamatalino,
Yeah.
pinaka-physically magaling,
Or may mana.
pinaka-wise.
Yeah.
Ibig sabihin, those are attributes that
Merit-based.
you
Yeah.
expect
Interesting.
to leaders. Hindi lang basta, siga ka, malakas ka, and so therefore. In other words,
Interesting.
those are positive values that people still expected their leaders to possess. So it's a kind of virtuous leadership that people still expected from their leaders. Apparently, yun ang medyo
So what
missing
you're
na
saying is
equation.
na-distort ito ng retail politics. That the idea of alpha, the big man of the tribe is not, because we saw that, diba? I mean, if the literature is very clear, the big man was the one who would help with hunting, who would help with distribution, keeping order. Ngayon, it's projection, it's populist antics and all of that. So, it's not really a continuation of pre-colonial per se, but it's a distortion of pre-colonial conception through the lens of retail politics.
Or that's morgified.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, the Frankenstein version.
Mas ganun ang version ngayon.
That's a very good point. That's a very good
Yun ang
point.
nakita talaga natin ngayon na sinasabi na
Actually, that's
if
a
we
good
try
point,
to
yeah.
clearly examine the types of leader that we have right now and the rise of, the political families, clans, dynasties, etc. No? Hindi na presidente din, nagiging norm rather than exemption. No? Kasi, nakita mo yung weakness kasi ng ating mga institutions. At yun yung sinasabi natin. Naalala ko dati, di ba, paborito mo si Douglas North, di ba?
Yeah.
Yung institutionalism.
Institutions,
Di ba? So medyo yun, nahi-ero dahil parang institutions, doon na tayo sa mga strong person, strong man. No? At yun ang mga gusto ng Pinoy Parang nagiging gano'n ang gusto ng Pinoy. But again, perhaps there is a way naman how to change
Which is
that
the
idea.
solution part I want to discuss.
Yun yung sa political parties Kaya lang, syempre, naalala
Yun
mo yung historical nila Carlian din, ng panahon ng the political party is simply boys man club, and at the same time, a patronage system, nawala yung esensya ng how political parties really are formed based on principles, based on ideologies, no? Ganyan sana yung una na yung PDP laban, yung mga first few days nagbibigay ng alternative. The original PDP laban, di ba? Pagkikyan ng maigi. Sila yung nagsabi talaga na hindi, better na federalism ang form of government rather than a strong presidential. So, and something like that. No, yan yung...
Although, okay, I'll slightly differ in that because from the American experience, just look at the Republican Party.
Yeah.
You had the golden era of Lincoln, right? And then later on, you'll have post-Reconstruction. And then you'll have these the men in the cigar room making decisions. And then you'll have a little bit of professionalization. Then you have so kumbaga may ebbs and flows ka makikita, even with the Democratic Party. It's not like they went from a pre-modern aristocratic group to a super modern
Democratic
European...
Party before, sila yung slave owner
Yeah, exactly.
It's the other way
and
around
then suddenly European style, di ba? What you see actually is a kind of what you see is an ebbs and flows.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you, Dean, what do you think about the argument na hindi talaga tugma sa kultura natin ng party system kasi masyadong abstract. Ang Pinoy gusto nila to put a face on it. Is there a way to actually put it together?
I've not lost hope. Kasi there's no other way to go if you want to mature in a democratic system Of course, it would still be Pinoy-style political party, but I guess we cannot pattern it exactly from Western constructs. Kasi iba talaga yung situation natin So, I'm not saying that it's impossible, but it would be, if we could develop a kind of political party system, it would have to be Pinoy style.
And is there something we can learn from comparable post-colonial nations like Latin America, Southeast Asia, I don't know, something? You think that makes even more sense? Like, bakit tayo parang Switzerland? Why not, learn something from, Colombia or Mexico?
Talagang no one size fits all.
Sure.
Perhaps you can get models, snippets from each of these examples,
Right.
and then try to develop your own model of how it would fit Philippine culture and practices.
Last point dito because may election tayo and a lot of big of course puro tayo mga analysis ng national elections. We have episode by our friends from Okta, Professor Ranjit, we have Dr. Garcia discussing down. Marami tayong pinag-usapan sa Senate election. But I want to talk about the local part of these elections. There's local aspect to these elections and I'm sure Dean Ed has a lot to say on that. What is your read of the local part of these elections? And also yung concern with, we already had some killings happening as we speak, right? Comelec is already trying to reassure people that they'll make sure hindi ganun ka-violent. Because a lot of the violence, the worst aspects of disenfranchisement happens in certain areas and also mostly local election talaga, right? Can we talk about that? Because that's the bedrock of our democracy, right?
Well, if I will try to analyze and based on my observation recently with the local government races, ang nakita ko either yung ibang mga political families walang kalaban or may tinatawag ngayong inter-dynasties competition sa mga local level. Bibihira lang for example na may mga competition ngayon na ang dalawang naglalaban ng partido ay hindi galing sa mga traditional na pamilya or political dynasty for that matter, no? Parang iilan lang ata. Pero mostly, for example, lalo na sa Mindanao, no, we are noticing yung inter-dynasties competition, no, na very apparent ngayon. So it's somehow difficult.
So sobrang na-box out mo lahat ng competition. Away kapatid na lang talaga to, literally.
Or pwedeng galing sa dalawang pamilya, nag-aaway. So again, it's different political families.
Away ng kabit.
Different political families, for example, na naglaban. Halimbawa, dito sa Zamboanga del Norte, you have the Halos-Hos and Uy, no? Mga political families na may competition para to position or in other areas na maraming mga ganyan. So, nawawala na yung mga inspiring local candidates sana na ang sabi nga nila yung mga green patches, no? Naalala ko sabi yan ni Ronald Llamas dati, yung green patches daw dapat
Ronald Llamas, parang may nakikita ako over the horizon.
Yan yung mga nawawala ngayon na pwedeng magsibo sa isang bleak nation, kailangan ng green patches. So perhaps wala ka ng Vico Soto ko sana sa mga iba pang mga lugar that somehow will represent a different perspective.
Sabi mo, sana may mga Richard A. Darren sa ibang lugar. Kaso personal nandata na siya sa ibang lugar.
So, nadalagin sa Mindanao.
No, just one point, no. I think it also relates to the opening salvo in our conversation this afternoon. Yung sinasabi kanina na the weakness of certain institutions and my pivot on the lack of critical thinking.
Weak state, weak society.
And the lack of critical thinking, nababox out na talaga yung people with very fresh ideas. But not to depress everybody, there's still hope naman. I think there are some, I would say, some
change makers.
Mga ganon, may mga sparks of brilliance here and there, may mga pockets of hope that we can see. And you know what's interesting is you can find them also in local politics.
Yes. So, yun yung contradiction.
That Mayor Magalong's Mayors for Good Governance, do you think that's an interesting... Actually, I suggested Vico and Mayor Magalong to work together like 2-3 years ago, right after that. And he took up. And he has this Mayors for Good Governance and all. I mean, we can have a long debate about what that group is all about, but do you think that's the way forward? Good mayors, good governance mayors working together.
Well, okay yun, but hindi lang sa akin, hindi lang mayors but even
governors,
talagang governors,
or
even
sangguniang kabataan.
Ang problema lang siguro hindi natin masyadong na-highlight in the discussion. Like there are certain inspiring governors in the boondocks, talagang mga remote areas in Mindanao, and you would think that their accomplishments are sort of minute compared to national statistics, but boy, they change people's lives, I tell you. So maybe siguro
and life and death questions,
just to balance it, siguro we should also talk about.
So actually, that will be hopefully our next episode, right? What I want to do, hopefully, Dean for next episode is maybe we'll discuss change makers at the local level na walang national promise. Literally go through the list. Because, for instance, Senator Rizon Tiveros was telling our common friends na meron siyang mga champions ng mga kabataan, including mga kabatch namin dati in Debate Society New, na ngayon, they're in different localities and actually doing what Vico is doing, except they don't have the same prominence and recognition.
Siguro din, baka gusto idagdag na...
So let's talk about the other ones.
Dapat pag-usapan din. You have to look for it.
Absolutely. So, actually, this
in
is
conjunction with the fighting political dynasties. Meron mga exemplar.
Exactly. So, there's a parallel good universe happening. So, thank you so much. As I said, everyone, this is not only a voter education, this is actually education for us. I am learning as I speak with our guests. And one of the things I look forward to learn more about are itong mga change makers who may not have the profile of the Vico Sotos or the profiles of other kind of dragon slayers, but actually, they're slaying even more than dragons in even more impossible conditions. And in many cases, alam natin, matter of life and death yon kung competent yung local leaders mo. In fact, one of the interesting things we're noticing with voters is mas mataas yung hinihingi nila sa local leaders kaysa national leaders. Parang national leaders, budots lang, pwede na yan. Pero actually, alam nila, kung hindi competent yung mayor mo, mamamatay ka, wala kang tubig, wala kang electricity. So there are many good mayors, local LGU leaders na hindi natin pinag-usapan but are actually changing the lives of millions sa ating kababayan. So, abangan nyo yan sa susunod na episode with the Dean and Dean. Pag-usapan natin, change makers across the Philippines. Maraming salamat.